Holly of Hollywood. This is our new series after 7 years. And when my daughter did it before, she was 9 years old, 10 years old, 11 years old. So here she is as a Berkeley student, Cal student. And the light of history that we're going to be speaking about is also why the light of history. We're going to be eventually talking about the 42 to 45, 41 to 45 years in the South Pacific, shedding a light on that history. But for now, Violet, shed a little light for me of what you've learned about maybe the value of history. You were telling me something earlier?
Yeah, so I graduated from Weed High School about 2 years ago, year and a half ago, and going through a small public school system, like in a small town. History was often brushed aside and not focused on as much in school, as seen as not as important of a subject as, let's say, math or English. Being one of the first students to ever get into a 4-year university from Weed High School and just any of like the local high schools here, being in a university now with a lot of diversity, a lot of different cultures, and a lot of history in itself, I have begun to realize how behind I am in a lot of knowledge in history. And having my mom, who is an avid reader of historical books, especially in like World War II, having my grandfather be in the military in World War II as well, I feel like there's a lot of history that I missed out on that I wasn't taught the importance of in my high school. So going forward now, I think that the importance of reading history and not using my education as a excuse to not learn these things, because I can do it by myself now too.
Yeah. And something that happens in school is that we get caught up in so much that's going on there.
Definitely.
And they have their textbooks, but the textbooks are sometimes boring.
Or
the
just
way
partial truths. They're not going to give you the whole
Yeah.
stories.
I mean, I had a history teacher, one of my history teachers over the summer was so boring. She just read, and she was
Right.
practically falling asleep while she was reading the book.
Mm-hmm.
But the reason I took that history class is that my interesting teacher, who was born December 7th, same as your brother, Pearl Harbor Day, he was so interesting, and I just loved the classes, but I didn't do
Right.
the work on the side. I didn't do the term paper.
Papers, yeah.
I didn't do it correctly anyway. It's a whole true confession there. But and so I actually failed or got a D in that class, so I retook it to get an A. And it was an easy A, but I didn't learn anything.
Right.
I just learned that the teacher was falling asleep, and I was like the second highest because I did the test well and I showed up. So you've, and I'm learning myself. I'm actually don't know that I'm an avid reader. Your grandmother, my mom, is an avid reader, and my sister is or your aunt is an avid reader. But I finally, after my stress level has been down less, I'm able to read a little bit. And even if I read just one paragraph or something, I'm going, whoa, whoa. And I guess what we did for Christmas is I read out loud to you. And so I'm glad that you're wanting to read. And I understand you have a close friend who almost laughed at you because you didn't know history.
Right.
Yeah.
I mean, when there's someone who's not even from the country that I live in or was born, they know more about my country than I do. It's kind of a odd feeling.
A wake-up call?
Kind of a wake-up call, right, which is a big motivation when there's people all around the world who know more about your own history than you do. It's sort of a slap in the face to kind of get in the books.
Yeah. Well, one thing is that years ago when I visited Alabama, I found a bunch of old newspapers, and the newspapers used to print full speeches of the president, full speeches. I found the speech Ich bin ein Berliner from John F. Kennedy, the full speech. But nowadays, you know, the news is very limited, even in our local press.
I mean, even so, there's so many different news sources, and compiling that information, figuring out what's the truest. And
Well, and even if you do like fact checking and these things, that who's
it's
doing,
not full stories.
and who's doing that? I mean, there's people behind it. So some of these biographies or these old books, and then I have, you know, in some of these books my dad wrote and your grandfather wrote in the paragraphs, which makes it more come to life. Dad did this, Dad did this. But one thing I found recently was the motion picture unit. It was the primary film production of the U.S. Army Forces, and it was called, one of their nicknames was Hollywood Commandos. And your grandfather graduated from North Hollywood High School in 1942. I graduated in 1976 from the same North Hollywood High School. We're immigrants up to the Mount Shasta area. You know, we're in the Mount Shasta, greater Mount Shasta school districts. What is it? The Siskiyou Unified School District?
Siskiyou Union
School District. And it's a wonderful place to be, clean water, pure air. But a lot of us have a history.
Right.
You know, we're actually Americans, and we're not like imports from another country necessarily. We are imports or immigrants from Southern California. You also from New York.
Yeah.
With your dad's family and New Jersey.
Of course.
But here we are in rural Siskiyou County, learning. And Dad, your grandfather, wanted to make a tribute to his fellow Marines who gave their all and then some. And it was great healing for him, also healing from his shell shock or post-traumatic stress. And there's things that can't be written directly, but you still read between the lines.
Right.
And one of the things that I'm discovering is the love of America that was also in the Hollywood industry. Warner Brothers, the Warner fellow was in this group. They had so much camera. So when you see on YouTube or World War II footage, they had real footage of that. Hal Roach, where the studio was for this motion picture group, was one who did Our Gang, 1930s Laurel and Hardy, and this and that. But go ahead, speak more of about the light of history and what you see there is some reason for reading on your own, even if you were in high school or even now.
I mean, I think that even in our own country, there's a lot of history to learn just about, I mean, American history and how, I mean, we aren't from this country. We came and settled here, and knowing
I'm from this country.
I mean, we're all from this country now, but I mean, knowing the history of that and understanding that there were like Native Americans here and with like a lot of divides too, it's important to read and know the history and what's going on now, because you're not able to understand current events if you don't understand the histories behind it.
At the same time, there is that possibility of past lives, and who says you weren't a Native American in a past life? Like,
of course, but
so your brother was born December 7th at 1:42, and what's so interesting to me is that your grandfather's name in or whatever squadron thing is VS 142. He always cut PO Box 142, 142 always comes up, and so there was something. One time I wrote a letter to Dad saying that, what if he was one of your buddies? You know, I grew up in the 70s, this and that. What if he was one of your buddies? And I found it after he died, and he didn't deny it. You know, some things you can't really prove. But there was a book called Children's Past Lives where a lady had her child being totally afraid of fireworks, and right or wrong, she went past, and he had these memories, allegedly, from being in the Civil War and the bombs and stuff. So there's soul memories, and then, okay, we're not from this country, but we are from this country. There is Americans. The reason why I say that so strongly, I just watched Sergeant York, and I read about his biography, and this is from World War I, a real person, but it was a movie called Sergeant York, but it was published in 1941, and he was very clear on, there's a great speech, actually, that he used to say that we are Americans. You know, he was from Tennessee, and it wasn't just that they were great Anglo, you know, from European, Scottish, Irish. He was saying, you know, that deep soul of what was from Daniel Boone, and there is something that is America and Americans.
Right.
So, which we had to learn. We have to relearn. We barely know.
Which I think that how strong we are as a nation now comes from how strong, because we have built from the ground up. And that we have had to be strong as a nation in order to get to where we are, being known as like one of the best countries in the world, for say. And like even in China, a lot of the times they refer to, in their language, but in other, you know, Asian languages, Chinese languages, they refer to United States as like the beautiful country. Like, this is a beautiful country, like, because people see this as having like wealth and
pure water
and pure water, everything. So I mean, I think that it is important to understand where we come from and what brought our nation to be as strong as it is today.
Now, your friend is from Taiwan, which is free China. But so here we go, Holly of Hollywood. So our history is not the old Italians, who came to we.
Mm-hmm.
We came from Hollywood. I came from Hollywood. I came from North Hollywood, Culver City, Studio City.
Mm-hmm.
And my family moved there from Texas. And before that, we were Texans. And the whole history of all these different areas of the United States, including the South and then New York. And then there's other histories that go way back. But there's way history, people do their genetic stuff, and then there's more current. So Hollywood, and then also Hollywood in the South Pacific, where, students graduated from high school, they went from Hollywood High, North Hollywood High, to World War II. Some were already in the studios, and they volunteered their services at age 50. Hal Roach for Roach Studios where they had the headquarters there, was 50 years old when he was helping with the motion picture stuff. Jimmy Stewart, your my stepfather, your grandfather, Bob, his dad helped train Jimmy Stewart, but Jimmy Stewart was a great voice in making some of the movies and the training things to get more American planes after they were wiped out in the Philippines and also in Hawaii within a very, very short time. So this book here, MacArthur's Escape on Buckley, is just fascinating. This is what I was reading to you over Christmas. I'll just read this first paragraph here. The fall of the Philippines in the spring of 1942 was a debacle of the first order. As far as anyone can be sure, about 76,000 men, some 12,000 Americans, and almost 64,000 Filipinos surrendered on Bataan on April 9th. It was the greatest capitulation. Sorry. Say that word for me. Sorry about it. Oh, I can't pronounce.
Capitulation?
Anyway.
Capitulation.
Thank you. Capitulation. Sorry. Mom would be cringing. Grandma. Sorry. In U.S. military history, a month later on May 6, almost 12,000 troops, most of them Americans, would be forced to surrender the nearby island fortress of Corregidor. And then later there were other surrenders, and that's what I was reading in this book, Rice and Salt, which the author of this book recommended, and a lot of the prisoner of wars there in the Philippines were recommending that December 7th, your brother's birthday and my high school history teacher's birthday, the interesting one, Pearl Harbor Day, that we celebrate, we recognize that, to fast on rice and salt, or at least have a meal of just rice and salt at least one time on December 7th, honoring that. This is an amazing book it was published in 1962, and he's so wanting to teach the youth and different people about what the lessons were learned both before and after that surrender, and how to survive guerrilla war, just like when you don't have anything, and how you make something out of a pineapple can, or just what the tools at hand to survive or to defend yourself. And this one was amazing about the PT boats. And then there's stories in here of that led me to watch YouTube things of, not YouTube, sorry, but TV things or whatever they call it, that they made, movies they made in those days about this epic. And, They Were Expendable with John Wayne and about this story. So you have an idea of your grandfather being World War II veteran, but like me, we really don't know much about that, right?
Right, and I think that reading is a good start with that, and like all of these books can tell a little bit of a story into that history, but I think that it is upon individuals to learn that history and dive deeper into it.
Yeah. Your grandfather George loved to read history, and there was recommended books of history, because there's a lot of propaganda out there, and even though some of it the definition of propaganda is different things, but there's a lot of anti-American propaganda out there. But in this group that was the Hollywood stuff in the 1940s, that was for America, education, but some people could call it propaganda. But it did inspire young men, and it inspired people. It helped the morale, too. The one that I saw recently with Jimmy Stewart, trying to get people to consider joining the Air Force, that you didn't have to be just a pilot. You could also be a gunner. You could also be this. You could help with the Air Force. And it truly inspired actually 100,000 plus young men to join the Air Force. and it was the Army Air Force, but they moved it just to the Air Force because most of our Air Force, which was the Army Air Force, was just taken out between Pearl Harbor, Clarksfield, and then Luzon or wherever it was. I'm not that much of an expert at all. And then this other place that Rice and Salt is, they were taken out there, and so we were helpless, absolutely helpless. And all these men had no other choice but to surrender. And when your grandfather came in, he came in with the Air Wing Division of the United States Marines for the liberation of the Philippines, the liberation of this area. So, but it's the humanity you read in here too. And again, as we spoke earlier, I'm not against the Japanese people. I love the Japanese people, and I have a good friend who's from Japan, and I've been to Japan, and they actually love America also. At this point, maybe there needs to be some forgiveness among some, but when I was coming back from Japan and Korea with your brother when he was 4 years old, we had an emergency landing over the middle of the Pacific, and there I see the Midway Islands, and I'm thinking that's a good place to land if you're going to lose an engine in the middle of the Pacific. And it turns out we kept going to Hawaii, but I kind of had a quick deja vu of all that history of World War II, of the gunfighting. And right when I came back, or the gunner stuff, the National Geographic published a issue of the Japanese military and the American military survivors putting a wreath right in that area. And it was a very significant moment in history. So, but there is healing. You know, there can be healing and forgiveness. But when you read history, if someone says Japs, you know, we're not going to erase it and say, oh, we can't say that because that's not, what do they say, politically correct, or it's not polite. It's just what was written, and it's what was called. And this particular person who wrote Rice and Salt, and he was a prisoner of war. He speaks of that. He was not just frustrated with the Japs, the Japanese, and there were many honorable Japanese also, but also the people who were, what he called the pacifists, you know, those people who didn't think that there was a need to be prepared, and this and that. But so is there anything more you'd like to share with your
I think thank you for having me on your Holly of Hollywood show today.
Should I wear a Trump 2020 to your UC Berkeley? No.
Anyways,
no.
I think that we should.
That would be an interesting history lesson. Can we videotape it? No.
That'd be current events for sure. Anyways.
No, I'm not going to try to stir anything up. But no, freedom. This is a big thing. To have freedom of speech and to say things and to agree to disagree and to not be beat up on our nation's colleges and universities. But sometimes it's good to be silent and to read things quietly and not to broadcast things. Do you agree?
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
So thank you again for having me on your show. I think
You're
that we
welcome.
should.
And I am so honored to have my daughter here, my beautiful daughter who's a Y2K baby. And thank you.
Of course.